Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Fredrik Eriksson. I'm very pleased to be here. Many thanks to the Independent Institute, Atlas, and the John Templeton Foundation for inviting me. I'm going to talk about a very small country that probably most of you never have visited. It's a country called Estonia. It's in Europe, as you know, in the Nordic part of Europe, close to Russia, Finland, Sweden, and the other Baltic countries. What I'm going to talk about here today is a paper that I wrote for the Independent Institute a few years ago. Alvaro came to me then to ask me if I wanted to write about Estonia and the Estonian economic reforms in the early 1990s when they were leaving the Soviet Union and became an independent country. And I was very glad to get this request or this question from Alvaro, because at that time I was about to reorbit myself from Stockholm to Brussels in order to set up this new trade policy think tank then. And when I was going back to the sort of external economic policy reforms that Estonia undertook in the early 1990s, I had the exact right inspiration for the sort of work that we wanted to do in Brussels, which is basically move to zero tariffs and have completely open borders for commerce with other countries. Writing this paper, I also had the chance to reminiscing some parts of the old Soviet days. Estonia was part of the Soviet Union. To some extent, I know that people are saying today that Russia resembles some part of the Soviet Union. I don't think that's true. You can say a lot about Vladimir Putin, but at least so far, we're not talking about the Soviet Union. But one great difference is the difference between Estonia today and Estonia what it was during the Soviet days. It's a completely different country. It has changed at a tremendous pace and all across the society. It has been a transition country, and I think in that regard, Estonia differs a bit from the other countries that we will be hearing from here today, and also the country examples that you have in the book, that it was basically about leaving an old communist, socialist economic order, transitioning themselves towards Western-style, democratic, market capitalist societies. And during that particular phase of transition, I mean, to some extent, they are still in a transition phase, but that transition phase is, you can say, almost over now. When it started, Estonia, the GDP for the average Estonian, the GDP per capita in Estonia was roughly 10% of the average in Western Europe. Today we're talking about an average GDP of roughly 65% of the average for Western Europe. So it is a country that has transitioned itself. It has created an entirely new economic political structure, and it has prospered quite significantly from it. The story of the Estonian economic reform program is very much one of instituting new economic and political institutions. But I think there are also a few other lessons to be drawn here. Of course, on policies and policy design, that policy design matters. And in the case of Estonia, policy design became quite interesting because they followed very simple rules. They want to go for simplicity and transparency in the design of the new economic institutions and the new economic policies that they opted for. They also moved very quickly. I think there are few economic reform programs that have been as swift as the economic reform program started, you can say, in August 1992 with a very comprehensive monetary reform in Estonia until 1993, when they also had finished the reform program on the external economic policies on the trade side, but also on domestic economic policies, on privatization and the establishment of a domestic capitalist order. Let's see if this one is working. All right, so when Estonia became an independent country in 1991, as we heard from Bill previously here, culture, history do play a significant role in the design of policies and also in the design of economic performance. Estonia didn't have much of an history to fall back to when they became an independent country. Until the end of the First World War, it has been part of Tsarist Russia. In 1940, it was annexed by the Soviet Union. Between 1941 and 1944, it belonged to Germany and was then taken over by Soviet Union again at the end of the Second World War. As I said, it's a small country. If you go far back in history, you can find an interesting culture of trade during the Hanseatic League in the 14th, 15th century. Estonia and Tallinn, the capital of Estonia, was one of the leading trading hubs in the Hanseatic League, and developed then a very sophisticated system and sophisticated institutions for trade. But of course, all these institutions, to some extent also the culture, had been totally erased by the 50, 60 years during Soviet rule. It was a completely socialized economy. It was part of the Soviet Union. It was not, in that sense, a satellite state. It was part of the Soviet Union. When Soviets took over the country in 1944 again, they started a very quick program of collectivizing the entire agriculture. They also took over the industries that existed, and basically since then, the economy as a whole was integrated into the Soviet economy. You can see that the economic performance or the welfare of the typical Estonian came to differ quite a lot with the average welfare of a Finn. Finland is a country perhaps which Estonia most resembles in terms of culture and also to some extent in terms of the economy. In the 1960s, the household income per capita, as far as we can measure it, was actually a little bit higher in Estonia than in Finland. But during the 70s, the 80s, and the 1980s, when the economic growth in Finland was very high, economic growth in Estonia was extremely low. There has been different sort of estimates on other sort of indicators of economic welfare as well. If you wanted to buy a color TV in 1986, for example, you had to work 547 hours of work in order to buy a color TV, while the equivalent figure in Finland was 92. And we can go through various sort of products in order to see how big these differences were. The economic reform program in Estonia started in 1989. This was still when the country was within Soviet Union. During the perestroika period, which started in 1996, you had some initial reform efforts. But in 1989, the government then, led by someone called Indrek Tume, started to toy with a few economic reforms. What he wanted to create was more of a third way between capitalism and socialism, and third way in his terms differed quite a lot from the political term third way that we have seen in the 1990s and 2000s, when we've basically been talking about a third way within capitalist societies. But it was basically about doing small incremental piecemeal reforms within the socialist economy. So what they started to do was to liberalize prices, which of course was one of the first important steps for Estonia to take. At the end of this first early reform period in the 1990s, they had actually liberalized most of the prices, so I think up to 85–90% of all prices in the country were liberalized. They also cut the subsidies, the fiscal subsidies, price subsidies from the government budget from roughly 15% to 2% of GDP. They also started a process of piecemeal privatization. But these reforms didn't create neither the sort of economic change or neither the goodwill for further economic reform that it was intended. And in 1991 and 92, Estonia entered very, very difficult periods, and they're talking about their winter of discontent in 1992, when basically the economy was collapsing, the Russian economy is collapsing, and with Russian economy, the Estonian economy was collapsing. They didn't get any immediate supply-side effects from the reforms that they had done. Inflation peaked. We had hyperinflation. The privatization that had been done in 1989 and 1990 has also led to a lot of corruption, a lot of asset stripping, and the idea of privatization at that point seems not to be conducive to sound economic governance. As we can see here, in 1992, the economy dropped quite significantly by 21.2% in 1992. The economy in 1991 and 1990 had also performed very, very badly, but 1992 was a significantly bad year. Inflation, as I said, it peaked in 1992. We had inflation of 1,076%. Hyperinflation was basically about to be rooted in the entire economy. This hyperinflation was pushed by the price liberalization at that point, which of course released prices from the constraints they have had before. Official prices started to become more like the black market prices that had been in Estonia for a long time. The price subsidies were reformed as well, which led to increasing prices. But Estonia was also importing a lot of inflation from Russia, and Russia at that point had even higher inflation. By the end of 1992, Russia had an inflation of 2,600%. Due to the system of internal trade within the Soviet Union, and also with the exchange rate system that they had built up shortly after Estonian independence, led to an even further push on inflation. But when Russia started to liberalize prices, and when energy prices in particular started to peak, this led to a very severe situation for Estonia. But things started to change, and from 1994, but more fair to say from 1995 onwards, economic growth was fairly high. And it continued to increase through the 1990s, even during the Russian financial crisis in 1998, and in the 2000s it has grown even further. Now, what was the basic elements or the basic parts of the economic reform program that Estonia undertook at this point? Well, firstly, they undertook a monetary reform in August 1992, which was extremely important. It was a monetary reform to basically break the neck of hyperinflation and try to restore macroeconomic stability to the country. As I said, Estonia at that point was importing a lot of inflation from Russia, and they needed to get out of the Russian ruble zone. So they established their own currency in 1992 and set up what is called a currency board or a currency board arrangement in 1992. At that point, the lessons from the Argentinian currency board was, it was more favorable than it became later. So I think they also were inspired by the lessons from Argentina from the early 1990s, when the currency board at least helped to break the neck of hyperinflation there. But the currency board is to some extent, is a very simple system, because what you basically do is that you give basically no role at all to the central bank. The central bank is going to issue money, coins, and notes, but these coins and notes, the monetary base needs to have 100% foreign reserve backing. Apart from that, the central bank has no things to do, or they are not giving any further role in the economy. Estonia's currency board was not a real pure currency board in the sense that a currency board aficionado would prefer, but it had certain features mimicking the currency board, in particular with the limited role for the central bank and the 100% foreign reserve backing. This led to a sharp increase in, I would say, trust and confidence, especially for foreign investors. It also have a clear impulse of fiscal discipline on the government. So what this reform did was to create macroeconomic stability in the sense that hyperinflation was braked, fiscal policy became much more disciplined, stability for foreign investors increased, and from 1994 and 1995, they could also see that foreign investors started to invest in the country to a quite significant pace. As you can see here on this slide, inflation started to fall already in the second quarter, but it continued to fall after the currency board was established in August 2002, and after a brief period of, let's say, a year, inflation had actually declined quite significantly. And if we would have looked at inflation from 1995 onwards, we could have seen that inflation has been fairly stable in Estonia over a long time period. Let me move on to the second part of the reform era, the second great part of the reform era. It was the trade reforms. At the time of independence, Estonia basically only traded with Russia or the Soviet Union. 90% of all its trade was with the Soviet Union. 2% of the trade was with countries outside the Soviet system. But what Estonia actually managed to do was to move themselves out from this system of basically being entirely dependent on trade with Russia to become what has been called the Hong Kong of Europe, in basically pursuing a very comprehensive, free market, free trade oriented approach, and approach that led to a sharp increase in trade, export as well as import. So at the time of independence, Estonia had to set up an own trade policy, and the typical country that are setting up a new trade policy would start to introduce new tariffs and other sort of trade barriers as well. Estonia didn't do that. They decided to go for zero tariffs almost straight away. They had a short period of time when they had a few low tariffs on agriculture produced, in particular tobacco, but they didn't move to the system of tariff and tariffication as many other countries in Eastern and Central Europe did. They wanted to liberalize, and they liberalized very swiftly. And Mart Laar, the prime minister in Estonia from 1992 to 1994, he coined this phrase, liberalize, then negotiate, which of course contradicts all the other, it contradicts the basic tenet of trade policy and trade, to some extent trade liberalization too, that you start to liberalize before you negotiate with other countries about liberalization. But Estonia didn't want to do that. They wanted to go for liberalization straight away. At a later point, they tried to bind these zero tariff policies in trade arrangements with other countries, with other Baltic countries, with the rest of the EU, and they also did free trade agreements with a few other countries that didn't belong to the European Union at that time. They also acceded to the World Trade Organization. It was actually a very funny accession to the World Trade Organization, because when you accede, you typically need to lower your applied tariff rates. But if you already have an applied tariff rate of zero, you don't have so many tariffs to lower. But the problem here at this point was that Estonia was about to join the European Union, and Estonia then thought, well, it's better that we bind our tariffs to the levels of the European Union, but then you have to bind them at a level which is much higher than the applied tariff rates you have. But this also created complications, because one of the principles of WTO accession is that you need to bind your tariff levels at a level which is lower than your actual applied tariff rates at the point when you accede. So it was, to some extent, a complicated accession from that point of view. Now, why did Estonia go for basically a Hong Kong, Singapore-style trade policy when basically all other Central Eastern European countries did not? They moved towards at least they had tariffs, other sort of trade measures as well, and these tariffs were typically fairly high. Well, I think there was 6 important reasons for why they moved in this direction. Firstly, the government of Mart Laar at that point was basically a classical liberal, and he took a very bottom-up view on policies, including the external economic policy of Estonia. So he didn't want to have He didn't want to have any border protection for Estonia. He also viewed trade reforms as a vehicle for other sort of reforms, in particular for the privatization process. So what he wanted to do was to get some help from the trade reforms for the other reforms that he wanted to do domestically at a later point. They also thought that a new tariff regime would be impractical. In the first place, just to establish a new tariff regime can be fairly complicated. It will take time, it will take energy, and you will be basically taking time from doing other things. But it would also be impractical in the sense that if you introduce tariffs, you would basically create a domestic constituency which favors tariffs and gets protected by tariffs, and that they didn't want to have. The economic crisis at that point also created an outward looking orientation for the economic policies. The interest groups that could have blocked these sort of trade reforms that had to some extent already been neutralized by the privatization process. But there was also a new breed of civil servants with strong free trade ideas that started to occupy the commanding heights in the economic ministries. This new breed was really a new breed because they were very young. I remember going to Estonia in the early 1990s, when at that point was working for the Prime Minister's office in Sweden, and I was there with he was the chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors at that point, and we went to a meeting, and we started this meeting and had a very interesting chat with a young man who was sitting there. And after a while, this chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors he was looking at his watch and was saying, "The central bank governor, when is he going to arrive?" And I said, "Well, I'm already here." At that point, he was 25, the central bank governor. He was only 6 years younger than the prime minister. So it was really a new breed of civil servants that came in and took up the new positions. The third part of the Great Reform era, I would say, was the enterprise reform, with, of course, the privatization process being the backbone of that system. The early privatization process in 1989, 1990 didn't lead to good results, basically to corruption and asset stripping. And one of the reasons for it was that they hadn't established the institutional system for free enterprise, property rights, commercial law, bankruptcy law, etc. This they did in 1991, 1992, and they wanted to do that before they moved on to establish or to design a new privatization program designed to basically privatize all state-owned enterprises in Estonia. They did that in two ways. They had a voucher system, like in the Czech Republic, where the citizens of Estonia, they received vouchers where they could buy, which they could buy shares in company for. This was typically designed for the privatization of smaller and medium-sized enterprises. But then they also used the East German Treuhand approach, which was basically about taking large enterprises, make them a little bit more competitive and a bit more structured before you sell them. And when Estonia sold them, they did that through international tenders and in a very transparent way, which led to that foreign investors became big owners of the big companies already from the start. The establishment of a new stock exchange was also tremendously important for the privatization process, in particular to establish an exchange for secondary trade in shares. It led to an explosion of new enterprises from 10,000 enterprises in 1991, which itself is a lot more than the 34 private enterprises they had in 1986, to roughly 61,000 enterprises, entirely private enterprises in 1996. They also did a tax reform, and that tax reform started in 1994 and was sequenced through the 1990s, which is basically a flat tax reform, with one difference. The VAT is not part of the flat tax reform. But it was a flat tax reform which opted for low taxes, which was 26% in 1994, and then they lowered this flat tax through the 1990s and also in the 2000s. The flat tax in Estonia today is 19%. So to sum this up, the Estonian reform story, what were the basic elements and what are the basic lessons from it? Well, firstly, reforms were swift and decisive. You can call them fast and furious when the Great Reform era started in 1992. They didn't spend much time in long, endless seminars on the exact design of it. They wanted to move swiftly, and of course, moving swiftly means that you're also going to make mistakes, but time was part of the essence here in their view. They had an economic crisis, which I think created, in this case, a milieu that was conducive to reforms. I don't believe in Naomi Klein or the shock therapy hypothesis that you go in to do free market reforms during economic crisis. I would say that a typical crisis response is that you regulate and undertake economic reforms, which you cannot really call free markets when you are in a crisis. You have a new political elite that undertook the reforms and occupied the commanding heights of the government departments. This, of course, was extremely complicated and sensitive because you basically had to squeeze out the old Soviet Estonian establishment, and of course it created a lot of tensions, but it was a very important part of it. You took your own people. When you had a change in government in 1992, you took your own people and placed them in key parts of the governments. The reforms were acts of faith. They were not, as I said, they were not based on extremely solid economics or long, endless seminars on how do you design policies. They were active faiths. They were instinctive policy reactions from the leading people in the new government. They wanted to go to zero tariffs because they believed in it, not because they had made endless number of studies on the effects of the economy of zero tariffs. They wanted to go for simplicity and transparency, to opt for the most simple solutions where you can clearly see if the system was going to be corrupted and if government started to do reforms of this system which was going to impede economic growth. So they opted for a currency board, which is basically a system where you have no discretion. It's a rule-based system without no discretion where the monetary policy works in accordance with the rules that you're establishing. They moved towards zero tariffs in order to have transparency. It was a very simple policy. It wouldn't create any internal political complications between sectors. Everyone was treated equally. As I said, time was part of the essence. They wanted to move swiftly. And lastly but not leastly, the economic reforms were also accompanied by political and constitutional reforms, and I think they were tremendously important in order to build a broad political support for the reforms, that at the same time that you undertook sharp economic reforms with serious consequences for a lot of people in Estonia at that point, you also did the political reforms to signal that this was not part it's not a new system where you're going to create a new elite which is going to rule this country. They were creating a democratic society, democratic capitalism in a way that Estonians favored. This also led to a very solid support for these reforms. Estonia had an endless number of government shifts since 1992 onwards. I mean, they basically changed government every year or every second year. But the support has been there and has given stability to the economy. Basically, all political parties, apart from the party which has some old Soviet connection, is in favor of this economic reform program that they undertook. All right, I'm going to stop there. Thanks a lot.